good morning to all of you. Can I be heard okay?
Yeah. Make it a little bit closer.
So special thanks to Jimmy and Dean for music. We need to be encouraged to see things as they are, and yet the music helps us, I think, to hear and see a little bit better. And I'm very grateful to Dick for facilitating us this morning. And I want to say how happy I am to know that two of my colleagues, going back quite a long way in the history of voices, were Sheila Abdullah and Ken Hannaford-Riccardi are here. We have had a long involvement in relation to Iraq and Jordan and Syria, other places. So it's certainly a privilege to be here also with all of you. You know, I learned recently, and I also want to thank Paul Shannon, who has welcomed me to come to Boston in this trip and help facilitate other events. I learned recently that the woman who founded the organization Save the Children, Eglantine Jebb, got her start because she had learned that children in Germany during World War I were starving. And even though it was in Britain, not considered very popular to express concern about a blockade that was starving children in Germany, Eglantine Jebb felt compelled to go to Trafalgar Square and to pass out a flyer condemning the blockade that would cause children in Germany to suffer and to starve. And so she was arrested, and she was brought before a judge, and she was convicted, and she was fined. But the judge paid the fine. And that became the first contribution to the organization Save the Children. And I read about that because I had been trying to study up on Save the Children's recent report that now 85,700 children in Yemen have died of starvation and disease caused by war. And Eglantine Jebb said that war is always a war against the child. And so I'd like to speak a bit further about that idea. You know, the United States is very complicit in this war against Yemen because we've been supporting, we've been arming, we've been sharing surveillance with people who are waging aerial terrorism, aerial warfare. And I think particularly of Saudi and United Arab Emirates' decisions to continue waging now close to 4 years of warfare in Yemen. Well, I want to back up a little bit, and I hope you'll tolerate me in kind of making a very horizontal move to another story, but I'll bring it back to Yemen. The Sisters of St. Bridget of Kildare, Ireland, had invited me a couple of years ago to come over to Ireland because it was the 10th anniversary of something that was called the Pit Stop Plowshares, and it had to do with Shannon Airport. And keep your eye on that Shannon Airport right now because two wonderful veterans for peace, Tara Koff and Ken Myers, are in the Limerick prison because they walked down to the tarmac of Shannon Airport wanting to investigate a U.S. military contractor plane that is helping to bring U.S. troops, military supplies, maybe even ammunition into Ireland for further deployment into the Middle East. And Ireland is a neutral country. It's against their own laws to be sustaining warfare and the promotion of warfare. So these vets for peace decided to help call attention to what's happening in Shannon Airport. And anyway, there's been a long history of activities protesting United States military presence in Shannon, and on the 10th anniversary of what was called the Pit Stop Plowshares, the sisters asked me to come back because I'd had some role in some of that. And so I said, oh yes, I'd love to come back to be with you. And they said, but Kathy, could you be meeting us in a field? I said, okay. And I went out to the prescribed field to meet them and the boys from De La Salle High School in Dublin. And the boys were as curious as I was. And pretty soon, you know, our socks are all sopping wet because the field was kind of rainy and wet. And then out came Danny Cusack, the town historian. And Danny Cusack began to help us understand that the big imposing building right next to the field was the Dunschlagen workhouse. And that in that workhouse, people had gone who no longer could feed themselves. They couldn't raise crops, they couldn't feed themselves, they were starving to death. They went into the workhouse full of people starving, weakened, sickened, typhus and other diseases rampant inside, and behind the Dunschlagen workhouse was a large field, which was actually a mass grave for unidentified bodies, but presumably people who had died in the Dunschlagen workhouse. And Danny Cusack, this careful historian, began to read the lists of names of people presumed to have died there. And those names sounded a lot like the names of the De La Salle High School boys. And in fact, they sound a lot like the names of people in this country who campaign now to send people back to situations of war and privation and suffering and hunger. And if those same people with Irish last names had sent their relatives back several generations ago, they would have been sending their own relatives back into famine. In Ireland, Danny Cusack, the town historian, told us 1 million people died of starvation, and 1.5 million became migrants, going to Australia, going to places like New Zealand and the United States. Well, I'd always sort of known, grown up as the daughter of an Irish mother, that there had been a terrible famine in Ireland. But I only recently became aware that at the same time, we could call this the late Victorian era, at the same time that 1 million Irish people died of famine, there was in northern China, India, the Maghreb, and Brazil, because of El Nino weather patterns, horrible extensions of famine that cost the lives of at least 20 million and possibly 50 million people. I never knew. No one ever taught it in curriculums I studied. This was news to me. Can you imagine the numbers of people bereaved and displaced? The numbers of people who had suffered desperately. And the similarity with Ireland was that the colonial authorities in those places did have the railroad transport systems, and there was food. People's lives could have been saved, but instead the choice was to export food and use the transport systems to take the resources in the opposite direction. And the reason I was reading about this is because something quite similar is happening again. All across Africa, in what's sometimes called the shoreline of desertification, more land is turning into desert. More families can't feed their livestock. The livestock become bloated and starved, and their carcasses can be found all across the shoreline of desertification. When the carcasses explode, they're full of plastic. People can't get water. People become desperate. And so they become nomadic in a sense. They've been pastoralists, they've shepherded their flocks or grown their crops, and there have been droughts and there have been floods, but nothing as bad and intense as it is now. And it's caused in large part by northern greenhouse industrialist gases and climate change. And so people in desperation begin to move. And where are they going to go? Well, many begin to move toward the Red Sea in hopes that maybe they can cross. It's just a little tiny crossing from Djibouti, say, over to Yemen. Well, Yemen, since 2015, has been a country at war and with huge conflict, but most recently, in 2015, the Saudis had begun to join that conflict with an air war. How in the world could people be trying to flee for presumably some kind of a better opportunity in life into Yemen, where 85,700 children have already died from starvation and disease because of war? Well, this is just how chaotic and how desperate the situation is. But I'd like to add in another factor, and that comes from a December report from the New York Times in 2018. Saudi Arabia, which is using United States supplies and weapons to fight largely an air war, is not sending Saudi soldiers on the ground to fight in Yemen. But there are battles being waged all up the coast of the Red Sea. And who are the fighters? The Saudis are paying $10,000 per fighter, which is a handsome sum, to people in Africa who are desperate, particularly in Sudan, particularly in Darfur. And so a lot of the fighting militias that the Saudis have organized, which they then communicate with through phones and through drone surveillance and through GPS, these militias are headed up and organized by the Janjaweed fighters. Very, very fearsome fighters, and fighters who were accused of terrific human rights abuses. But not only are they the seasoned Janjaweed fighters, families are so desperate in Sudan to feed their children that they will pay, if they can scrape it together, a $1,031 bribe seems to be the going rate. They'll pay a bribe in order to get their teenagers enlisted in these fighting militias. And so now the New York Times is reporting that the militias comprised of Janjaweed soldiers and child soldiers have 20 to 40% of their fighters under 21 years of age. And so the children. Eglantine Jebb with Save the Children said, war is always a war against the child. So I want to then go back to what kinds of warfare are being waged in Yemen. You know, the very first place that was hit by the Saudis was a sewage and sanitation facility. And the workers were in a scramble. How are we going to keep this place going? And the next place that was hit was the nearby electrical facility. And so they not only had to deal with the sewage and sanitation facility being bombed, then they didn't have any fuel. And so they were using diesel fuel until that ran out. And this can be guaranteed to lead toward cholera. Fisheries were bombed. Roadways were bombed. Systematic efforts were made to make sure that the infrastructure of Yemen couldn't function. Clinics were bombed. Doctors Without Borders hospitals were bombed. And I shouldn't keep this in the past tense. It's still going on now. And I want to draw particular attention to the story of a village called Arhab. And villagers there realized, you know, the government is never going to help us. The water table is going down. We don't have water. So they got together and said, we'll all chip in. And one particular person gave even more than everybody else. And they managed to get a rig to drill themselves, to drill down, down, down for water. And they kept going down, and there's no water. And finally, they hit water. And so there was a celebration. People got together, they celebrated all night long, and as they were going back to their various dwellings, and the person who had really kicked in the most was feeling very proud of himself, all of a sudden a bomb was dropped on them, and the shards from that bomb were flying at 8 times the speed of sound. People were decapitated, they were maimed. The person who had been so glad that he started this project and put in the he was in a hospital and bleeding to death, and his body was badly, badly maimed. Well, this was in the middle of the night. So when the sun went up, villagers went to the place, and there were some who had not sure what happened, been sure what happened to their loved ones. And others thought maybe they could help. And many were children. The parents didn't grab them back, and they were curious, and they just went. So about 100 people had gathered at this site. And then more warplanes came, and the people that were there were bombed relentlessly. They said it was a nightmare that even as people were fleeing, it was as though they were being chased by the bombs. And those bombs were all manufactured by Raytheon. So we're very far away from the war, and yet in many ways we're very close. And the United States shares surveillance with the Saudis, and how could they have picked out a water drilling rig as a target in a remote rural area? A similar story, and this one got much, much, much more notoriety, but they were children. They were on their school bus. It was a field trip to reward them because they had studied hard, and they had each been issued a UNICEF blue backpack, and inside the backpack were vaccines and vitamins, and children's antibiotics. And so you know how kids are. You've been chaperones on field trips maybe. They're all squealing and squirming. And all of a sudden, while their teachers, many of them were in the bazaar getting picnic supplies, a bomb was dropped right on the bus. 44 children were killed. We can identify names of 36 of them, but pity the poor emergency medical workers who turn up and are trying to reassemble the bodies. It's very, very hard to identify all of the people, the children, and some of their teachers who were killed. And this time, it was a Lockheed Martin manufactured bomb that had been dropped on that bus. And so, there are very, 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 very dangerous crossings that are going on as the migrants go into Yemen. You know, Yemen in 2016 took in 117,000 refugees. There were already 225,000 Somalis living there. In 2018, 150,000 refugees entered into Yemen, beleaguered, bombed, battered Yemen, taking in refugees. And there are guaranteed acts of cruelty that go along with chaos of war. And so the smugglers who've been bringing people over, they charge as much as they possibly can for someone just to get a seat on the boat. And sometimes once the people are on the boat, the smugglers pull out guns and they threaten everybody on the boat. Sometimes the boats capsize because people panic and unknown numbers of people, but in the hundreds, wash ashore. Sometimes when the smugglers get to the other side, they set up their own black site private detention center, and they torture people until they give a phone number of somebody who can be extorted for more money back in Africa. It is ghastly and it's terrible, but I want to say that the most dangerous crossings, the ones that are most reprehensible, that should stir in our souls grief and rage, are the ones that are undertaken by United States elected officials, former Secretary of State Paul Ryan, going over to Saudi Arabia, shaking hands and making deals with the Saudis, saying, we'll supply you with the weapons you want. We'll help you continue this war so that you can decapitate and maim and destroy and bludgeon people in Yemen into submission to the desires of financial oligarchs who are actually functioning as warlords. Don't let anybody tell you that this is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This is a war designed to bludgeon people who weren't completely cooperative into submission. And so the wars rage on. We've had movement in the United States Senate and Congress, particularly after the gruesome murder of Jamal Khashoggi. People started to think, well, maybe we don't want to be so in league with the Saudis. Their practices are hard to justify. But, the United States is still making attacks against supposedly Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, even though, there's no guarantee whatsoever that the people that are being attacked pose an actual threat to people in the United States. So I want to close by going back to Eglantine Jebb and her brave submission that war is always a war against the child. And we have an opportunity in this country to speak lovingly of the children in our own lives. I think about these very young children who are organizing themselves to say, we have to deal with the greatest terror we're all facing, the terror of what we're doing to our own environment that's causing the global warming and the climate change and the consequences that we'll inherit. We have that opportunity to be in line with, in league with, children of future generations, in a sense, and to say that we will not go along any longer with the war makers and the warlords. And I'm so fortunate to have Paul Shannon here, who has been working right in your area very, very consistently and very strategically in challenging the Raytheon Corporation, a particular supporter of war in Yemen. So I'm going to call Paul forward. Thank you. And if there's time for questions and comments later, that would be great. Thank you.